Hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our seventh talk in the series Tibet in Canada, Canada on Tibet. As you know, let me just move forward. This series tries to see who is at the intersection of Tibet and Canada. So this can be scholars based in Canada, studying Tibetan culture, Tibetan history, or Tibetan scholars also based in Canada, or as we will see on the 21st of March, a scholar who is neither Tibetan nor Canadian, but who studies Tibetans in Canada. So we are very happy and fortunate today to have Marc Desjardins. It's my great pleasure to introduce him, who's a member of our GRIT team here in Montreal. He's an associate professor at the Department of Religions and Cultures at Concordia University, and he has studied Bön religion for over 3 decades, both from a philosophical and historiographical point of view, so looking at text and the evolution of ideas, and also from an anthropological point of view, so analyzing current rituals and practices from a fieldwork perspective. So, apart from being a great friend, he's also one of the few scholars, and actually, this number is rising now, who's able to bridge the academic worlds of Chinese studies, so Chinese religions and history, and Tibetan studies, Tibetan religions and history. And this talk today is an example of this dual expertise. He is fully trained in both, and he offers innovative ways of looking at Tibetan religions, looking at the larger picture of things, and analyzing cultural borrowings and transformations, including also, of course, elements of Tantric Buddhism and esoteric traditions of India in the process. So he was first trained as a Chinese medical doctor in China and in Chinese in the 1980s. He then turned to the study of Chinese and Tibetan religions, receiving his MA and PhD from McGill University, studying, among other things, esoteric Buddhist Chinese texts. He also pursued a postdoc at UBC in Vancouver on more contemporary matters like conflict resolutions. So his research delves on religions and cultures, past and present, along the Sino-Tibetan borderlands, especially Sichuan, I believe, studying Bön, Tibetan indigenous cults, and Chinese, especially Daoist, ritual practices. For his latest book that just came out a year ago at the Library of Tibetan Classics, titled The Tradition of Everlasting Bön, the five key texts on scripture, Tantra, and the Great Perfection, which was years in the making, this text. So he translated five treatises ranging from the 12th to the 15th centuries, emblematic of the current worldview and practices in contemporary Bön. He's also part of the big ERC project, Pagan Tibet, documenting the first reconstruction of pre-Buddhist practices in Tibet, headed by Charles Rambaud in France. So without further ado and much excitement, the floor is now to you, dear Marc.
Thank you very much, Isabelle, for this presentation. I didn't know all these things about myself, so maybe anyway, so it's good to be reminded of all one's duties, actually, and what I have to live up to, hopefully. So welcome, everyone, and thank you for coming. So I will start by sharing my presentation, I guess. Partager. Can you see? Can you see?
Yes, perfectly. Maybe you can, yeah,
Yeah.
full screen, yeah.
I'll do the diaporama. It takes a while. Okay, so I didn't know exactly who was going to show up to this talk. So for now, let's say it might be a bit preliminary for many, but then in the question period, then we can go into the nitty-gritty of things that are most interesting indeed. So this basically is a research project that started quite a few years ago. I mean, officially 2019, and it's part of what we call the Social Science and Humanity Research Council, which is one of the main agencies that support scientific research in Canada. And then it was a project that I submitted and that was accepted. And then it was done in collaboration with Daniel Berunski from Charles University in Prague, of whom many of you know also. And this has to do with the study of something. I was looking for something that actually could tell us more about Bern as it may have been before, let's say, 1072, when there was the foundation of Erubensaka in central Tibet, which became a kind of very important and central, not necessarily monastic, probably partly monastic, but let's say religious center, where from when Bern started to be really organized in a vehicle, in a manner to be able to kind of compete with the rising popularity of Buddhism in that period of time. So we are talking about, the 12th century, let's say, and onward. And history have shown us that actually the establishment, Eru Bensaka, which eventually was destroyed by flood in 13 70s, I think, or 80s. I can't remember. Sorry for that. Eventually, it was transposed and recreated in another part of Tibet, in the mountain behind Jikatse, and then by Nyamepa, Sherab Jensen, who actually found a Mary monastery. So this Mary tradition basically is emblematic of the form of Burn that we encounter mostly today. But there was some text basically in the Burn canon, which was compiled some time ago, that actually showed little editing or showed kind of a substrate of a religious practice that seemed to predate this kind of very repackaging of Burn, let's say, or local traditions and so on. So I became interested in one book in particular that had never been studied, and it's called the Sadak Boom, and then which stories goes on, as you can see here. Sorry, which was rediscovered at some point in time in the 11th century, possibly, or maybe earlier. We don't know exactly. And then it's a large text. This is made about 226 folios, so 451 pages and so on, in 54 chapters, talking about how to propitiate one type of deity that is called a Sadak. So I'll talk a bit about it. So basically, my goal was to study non-Buddhist element, let's say, in Bumpo literature. That was the goal of it. Let's see. So this basically collection, the Sadak Boom, is part of what we call the Bumji, or the Fourfold Collection, right? And this Fourfold Collection, basically, okay, I need to get rid of some windows. Right, okay. So it's a collection of 4 different collections that actually each of them deal with various types of spirits. So, 4 classes of spiritual being the Lu, that often, because of the influence of Buddhism and so on, is often translated as Naga, but actually in the Tibetan context, it's actually way more than that. So this is one collection, which is very known as the Lumbum, Kapo, Napo, and so on, that has been studied before. And then there's the Nien collection that Daniel Berunski is a specialist on. No one is doing the two, but then I was happy to be able to consecrate quite a few years, on the study of the Sadak Boom. So those are all very well-known spirits, especially the Lu class, right? They are considered as the original beings from which all other beings descend in some of the Bumpo books. So basically, all the others, being the Nien, the Sadak, the Tu, and so on, are actually kind of not necessarily evolution, but let's say can retrace their pedigree or their original state of being into the Lu. So they would be either a subclass of Lu or evolutionary classes of Lu according to these type of writing. As I mentioned, they mostly see as Nagas, in the Buddhist context, but actually in the Tibetan context, they are not just, half snake, half human, but they can take lots of different shapes. such as deer, tortoise, snake, fishes, and other. And they fulfill a lot more purpose than just being subterranean deities, that are curtailed into the traditional Indic model of the Naga, let's say. So whereas the Nien, which we see them, where their cult of the Nien is very popular on the steppe of the northeastern Tibet, let's say in Amdo or Qinghai and those places, the Nien are kind of wandering beings, very violent and mostly depicted riding horses. Whereas the Sadak are a different types of being of which I will talk a bit more about. Let me introduce. And the other one, which is very little known, are the Tu, which are supposed to inhabit crags and rocks and so on. Up to date, no one has studied the Tu. I heard that there might be a prospective PhD student working with Charles Ramble that might want to delve into that, which would be very good. The texts, however, are extremely difficult to read because they use they've never been edited. There's a lot of orthographic, let's say, peculiarities. We cannot say really errors, but rather peculiarities. And also they're a bit very disjointed. So the tubum, whoever works on it, will have my greatest, how you say, respect, because it really is quite a challenging text. So what is important about these for full collection is that it's a collection of different narratives that were brought together. Some of them has to do strictly with rituals. We can call them rubrics, right? Ritual rubrics. Some others contain some myth, origination myth, for which we know that the early burn texts, or let's say non-Buddhist texts or ritualist texts, indulge quite a lot, whereby the monk or the narrative, the myth, for instance, needs to be recited in order to make the ritual efficacious, because it tells basically of the origin, the covenants that were set up between humans or some mythical hero, right, like Tumpashirab or some others, and then this makes the kind of legitimacy of the rite, and then it brings efficacy. So this is something that is mostly not, which is not very common anymore in contemporary Yungdrung burn text, means the burn that was formulated by the Meiji or Eruben Saka school, let's say, that I spoke about earlier. As I said, there's cosmetic addition, but very few. Some texts we can see that there's been, text written possibly included by Pandit from the Yungdrung Burn school, because it talks about Shenrab as being kind of the primary beings, the originator of all rituals and so on. But many of this chapter of the Sadak boom doesn't talk about Shenrab at all. Actually, it doesn't. It shows various different types of ritual that today no Yungdrung burn would ever dare do, especially those involving blood sacrifice and so on. So what's the main theme of the Sadak boom, right? It consists in giving instruction to the rite addressed to elemental and stellar spirit. So Sadak is often translated literally as the Lord of the grounds or the earth, and that's how I translated the title of that was I made the title of this project. But the land is not really a physical land. It's not to be confused with the Yula or the local deity. What we call in French la divinité du terroir, or the Tudigong in Chinese, right? Which is really the supervisor of the local geographical area. The Sadak basically are not that. The grounds or the planes that they are controller of are mostly astrological moments, conjunctions, or symbolic elements like, the 8 trigram and so on. So it's a completely different universe than what we think it is. So it's really, astrology is a big part of it. So the earth itself refers to the universe, and the ground of what we would call conditioned existence, and then, or, momentary existent or momentary astrological phases, and then it refers to its spirit administrator. So as mentioned, the Sadak boom is a collage of different sections, some exhibiting a lot of Yundum burn lore, as I mentioned, because they talk about Tumpa Shenrab, sorry, which is the main hero, mythical hero, the enlightened one, let's say, of the Yundum burn or everlasting burn or eternal burn, whichever way you want to translate it, or Tojel Yekien, for instance, also, to whom many write connected to the Sepela and all types of other ritualist systems, those that we find along the, in Bhutan, and those that are documented by people like Kazan Trashi, for instance, or Tony Hubert, who did a lot of work on that. So those are, alternative lineage, let's say, of what we would call burn. We cannot say necessarily Yundum burn, but a lot of the lore of the non-Yundum burn have entered Yundum burn. We can talk about it a bit later. Okay. So the goal of these rituals, basically, because they are grand rituals that may last several days, they are to reharmonize the world. And you do that by calling the descent, of all these deities that control the universe, the known universe, so these stellar deities. And then you give offering and you pacify those very irascible deities, that actually rule during certain moment of astrological or planetary conjunction and so on, of celestial or the elements and so on, right? So for those of you that are, knowledgeable, for instance, about the Taoism, for instance, there's the Jiao ritual, which is exactly what it is. The goal is to call down the gods and go up. It's a bit more kind of celestial bureaucracy system than what you find in the Tibetan version, but the goal seems to be very similar. So reharmonize local communities to kind of the beneficial, orderly, cosmic uh, uh, vibes or influences. So when do we know? What are the indications that can tell us how ancient it is and how representative of, let's say, non-Buddhist or early, imperial period time? Well, we know that the cult of the Sadak, as it's performed today in Yunlongburn, is anterior to the 12th century, for sure. So 12th century, so we're talking about the Song dynasty, where the first part of the Song dynasty, where Taoism ended up becoming institutionalized. Actually, it was before that during the Tang period, but with the all the way to Song Huizong, basically, this is the period whereby Taoism was extremely strong. And then, so there is some sort of influence, and we'll come to that. Right. Okay. So we know that the Leo ritualists, Sipei Labumpo or Sipela, or the worldly gods, Sipela, that's what it means. The ritualists that propitiate these, are still extant in the peripheral era of what used to be the Tibetan world, or the Tibetan, let's say, the central government controlled territory, right? Which was pro-Buddhist, and then which actually try its best to convert the Bumpo to Buddhism and so on, so that we find Bumpo communities in what used to be the peripheral area. One of the places that I did a lot of field work, for instance, spent a lot of time, was Songpan, or Amdo Shako. And then this is Amdo Shako, basically, or Songpan, is a prefecture whereby everybody is on, almost everybody, with one little exception, actually two of them, are Bumpo. And this was kind of, a place whereby neither the Qing dynasty Chinese government nor the Ganden Puchan Tibetan government had a lot of control. And then so this is so they were like, along the former Sino-Tibetan frontier. And the fact that we find so many Bönpo there is indicative of these type of, maybe not persecution, but very close to, or, kind of, pushing away, the Bönpo if they do not convert kind of policy. So I'm afraid, there are lots of evidence that suggests that this was happening and so on. So, okay. So in Tibetan Buddhism, so the Sadak are basically astrological position. That's what they are. And you find that in a very famous treatise that was written that the Desi Sanji Gyatso, that was, I think, 17th century or 18th century. I can't remember the date, but he was the regent of the fifth Dalai Lama. So anyway, I think I might have written it somewhere here, hopefully. So as for, so the aspect of, popular deities as well as Tibetan deities and or let's say astrological position, all these kind of status and operative function of the Sadak are to be found in the Sadak book. The reason why I said the 12th century is because there was a famous master, Bönpo master by the name of Chungo Tse, who was a treasure text discovery, so a terma terten. And then he was a master of one famous Bönpo, let's say, how you can call him. I mean, he was really a very extraordinary man in that he's one of the codifier, or one that brought about, the Bönpo doctrine to a level that didn't exist before, and by the name of Ajalojo Jensen. I translated one big text of him in the publication that Isabel actually mentioned a bit earlier. Chungo Tse was actually one of the many masters of Ajalojo Jensen, who ended up sitting on the abbatial chair of Eruben Saka. So, Chungo Tse wrote a ritual book, which is called the Nielam Debji, right? Or the path, the nearing path, of the propitiation of the four categories of spirits that I mentioned before. So basically, he seemed to have used a collection of these fourfold collection, which contains the ritual prescription for the Lu, the Nien, the Te, and the Sadak, and organized them into a cohesive method of worship or a cohesive ritual, which is still done today, and which is called the Nielam Debji. Actually, when you look at the photograph of the mandala that is on the poster for this talk, this is actually the mandala that the Chungo Tse, or maybe later Pandit, actually derived from Chungo Tse's propitiation ceremony. So it's very interesting. Okay, so I mean, we've talked already about, what I call the everlasting burn. I prefer everlasting to eternal. I think it was David Snellgrove who used that word because it gives a kind of dynamic aspect that eternal means, like frozen or something that, but maybe not. Anyway, I like this word. So everlasting burn or Yungdung burn. It is, as I mentioned, a synthesis of Tibetan indigenous religious practice with added adaptation of Buddhist soteriology, ethics, and practices of meditation and the Tantra. So some people, I remember one famous scholar actually, when I just came back fresh out of field work, I was talking about burn, he say, oh yeah, burn. Well, it's kind of a Buddhism form of Tibetan adaptation or something like that. But actually, we know much more today about burn that, we cannot, we cannot say that burn is just a plagiarism of Buddhism because it's way more than that. At the time of Eruben Saka, during the time of Ajalojo Jensen and so on, there was a lot of Buddhist schools that were being established, and the Kadampa was one of the schools that was very influential in those days. When we look at the historical map of Tibet, we can see that central Tibet was a place whereby there was a lot of missionary activities, and there was a lot of master that end up, teaching various form of Buddhist practice. And when it came to, for instance, the study of logic or the study of meditation and so on, or not meditation, but philosophy, we know that most religious scholars, be they Bunpo Buddhist or in between or whatever, would go often there to assist to the course, which were open, and then brought back that, information and kind of use it. So we can say that, through encounter with Buddhism, Bön decided to kind of reorganize itself. And then so, yes, there are parts of Buddhist soteriological principles and idea that are woven into Bonpo discourse. But when we look at the ritual cycles of Bön, today what we call the tantric form of Böns and so on, like Geike, Porwa, Maju, and so on, we can see that there are lots of indication that many of the members or most of the members of the pantheon of these various ritual cycle are actually not necessarily Buddhist, but rather maybe, divinities that might have been at some point local divinities, right? That eventually were brought together into an organized system. And possibly the reason for that had to do with the fact that, Bern had to compete with a religion that was already well structured, very developed, very good at argumentation and debate and so on, and that when it came into Tibet, it was already ready for a battlefield. It was a kind of ideological army that had all its tool and armament, well ready and well tuned, whereas the local religions, which the later Buddhists called them, well, anything that is not Buddhist is called more or less like Bön, then, had very little chance to compete with that. So I think that Everlasting Bön or Yundum Bön was kind of a movement to bring about some sort of, competitiveness to the survival of local religions in a more organized manner. But anyway, this can be debate, and, it's my own personal conclusion up to now. So one characteristic of Yundum Bön is there is no use of blood offerings, right? Okay. So whereas was some scholar write Bön with a small b, they would say, well, this we could use it as kind of, non-Buddhist ritual that were aimed at serving local community, and then that were transmitted to agnatic lineage or paternal lineage or some lineage that were kinship lineage. This is the case in some of these non-Buddhist ritual practices that are found in Bhutan, for instance, described by Kezan Tashi and Tony Hubert, and then some others also. And there might be connection with the Nashi also. So, I mean, it's a fairly complicated thing, but one of the common thing that they might have is that they use blood offerings. So, and there's also Bön that we read about, and that seems to have been tied to the power structure and the administration of the Tibetan Empire. And then we know about that from the fact that there seem to have been ritual specialists. Some of the ritual names that we find in the Dunhuang manuscript, for instance, will tell us about the Shen and the Bön. And then so Bön and Shen were kind of two specialists of different types of ritual, for instance. That's what we may infer. We know that Marcel Laloux, for instance, when she studied the royal funerals, of the Tibetan Empire and so on, she associate, for instance, one as, I think it was the Shen, as the sacrificer, or the one that would do the blood sacrifice, and the other one would be maybe those that do the jer, the recitation and so on. At this point, it's very difficult to ascertain for sure. There's a lot of contextual evidence that maybe point to that, but we cannot say for sure. So what we know is that there were ritual specialists, and then that these actually were transmitted even up the way to the time of Erubensaka through family lineage, like the Zhu, the Pa, the Shen, and so on. And some were specialists on funeral, for instance, some in exorcism, some would do, mostly healing, some other were into more philosophy, meditation, and so on. And there was, of course, war magic that was used. So what we, attacking the enemies of the empire. This was very much in tune with what was happening, for instance, in China, where during the Tang Dynasty, so 618 to 907, I think, during the Tang Dynasty, there was the rise of what we call esoteric Buddhism, and esoteric Buddhism was actually, very present at court. And the emperor would ask, for instance, one of its main priests, Pukung or Amogavajra, for instance, to do a ritual of war magic, which would be to send spirits, in this case, they were esoteric Buddhist spirits, to go and fight against the enemies of the empire. And then, so, of course, there is anecdotic evidence in Buddhist writings of, the efficacy of this rite, they were able to repel the barbarians and so on. So, I mean, in Tibet, you can see that this was most likely also one of the main role of these priests. So when we come to this, I talked a lot about China and I talked about Tibet and so on. So what's the connection, right? Well, there is a definite connection, not necessarily because of the fact that, there were Tibetan kings that were married to Tang Dynasty princesses and so on. And then there's a lot of legends saying that they, one brought Chinese version of Buddhism and so on. That's okay, that's nice and so on. But actually, the text in question, the Sadak Boom, says itself that actually those rituals come from China. So you have the text down there, and then between the arrows, you can read it, So my loose translation is this: the highest, middle, and lower section of this manual on the reformation of the Lords of the Ground, or the Sadak, is now complete. So this is the colophon at the end. So that's it. I've written it. This demonstration is that of the ritual tradition of the seven gods. These were requested by Agnes Certain and are translations of the ritual conducted by the Chinese in the eastern regions. These teach both practice for the living and practices for the dead. Ritual activities conducted in both a relaxed or a peaceful manner and a forceful manner. These are the method or burn. These are the burn pertaining to all disorders in the sick, the dying, and the old. Right. Okay. So in this text, you don't find that in the Nyen Boom, Lum Boom, or the Tu Boom, but you find that in the Sadak Boom. So an open acknowledgement that the tradition comes from China. Okay. So the Sadak, what are they? Okay, sorry. Now, can you hear me? Hopefully you can.
Yes, no problem.
Okay, thank you. So they are personification of cosmological conjunction of ground that I explained. And then how they are organized, they follow a Chinese traditional template. And it is basically how time was calculated from very ancient times. I mean, we have example of these heavenly stalk, the use of these heavenly stalk and the earthly branches, inscribed on Jagu and, and bone oracle inscription that date from the Zhou dynasty. I mean, so we're talking about, the beginning of the first millennium BCE. So it's a long-standing practice. And then eventually, so it tells you, for instance, this is a translation, for instance, water yin oxine, right? Wood yang tiger, wood yin rabbit. This is exactly how you can identify these various Tiangan and Dija, these various elements that create the sexagesimal cycle of calculating time, right? So, and each of those are classified according whether they're female or male, so yin and yang, and to which element do they belong, meaning the five traditional phases, the wuxing, of Chinese cosmology, and so on. So one chapter, for example, chapter 8 of the Sadak Boom, contain a list of 37 Sadak ordered along these Chinese calendrical position. And you have their names. And this is very interesting. I didn't bring the table here, but let's say they are named like Tese in Tibetan, which come to Tai Sui in Chinese, and so on. So it's very interesting to see that. Sometimes you have it's not just a mere translation of the name, though sometimes you have, for instance, names that are translated into Tibetan by the meaning, but sometimes it's just kind of how you say that, transliteration of the sound, right? I mean, this is what you can see in Yungdungben. This is how the Sadak are portrayed, for instance, right? So, I mean, you can see right away that it's really a standard format of portrayal of the Sadak, right? Okay. So, okay, so there's we know about, the Sadak boom mentioned many, many, many times, the fact that it's come from China. I mean, China is mentioned over 40 times, and then, or it talks about, this in the language of China and so on. Those are key phrases and so on. Sometimes you have a mixed also. You do have, the use of, well, it acknowledges something that is coming from India, for instance. And then so it gives us some idea about a possible early chronology and so on. But what is most interesting to me anyway is the use of the 8 trigrams, right? And then the myth that are recounted or narrated, in the Sadak boom. And so it's a version that follows the Chinese accepted ones, but maybe have a bit of differences and so on. So it talked, for instance, of the 8 trigram, the originator of the universe is Old Father Sky, so Tian, that everybody knows, and Old Mother Earth, which is Kun, in Chinese. So, and the word is written also in Tibetan, transliterated and so on. Uh, and then uh, and then there's a lot of Chinese character in the Sadak book. Means not Chinese written character, but Chinese or people that were considered as Chinese master. And one of them is Kongsi, Kongsi Trulje, the miraculous king, or the king of miracle, whose name is Kongsi. And it obviously has to do with Confucius, the Chinese Confucius by the name, but has nothing to do with the character, unless it portrays some sort of magical form or mystical form of Confucius that were popular and became circulated among the popular people in China. And we have example of these type of texts in the Western Han Dynasty. So we're talking about the first, second, and third centuries CE, where they were actually apocrypha, which tells about, famous tales about famous people and so on. And they were quite important in that period of time, especially for the development of popular religion, the formation of Daoism, and so on. Okay, there's other character, of course, like King Juzetru, Truggyjalpo. Okay. As of now, not quite sure. The king, the princes Liu, and then and so on. So those are elements that are difficult to identify up to this point. Okay, let's talk about what it refers to. What's the Chinese cosmogram that it talks about? Basically, it talks about some Chinese lore that were very popular during the Han Dynasty, the Eastern and Western Han Dynasty. So we're talking about 226, I think, 206, sorry, BC till about 221 or 220, CE. So we're talking about 400 years of various type of lore that became very influential at court, at the Chinese court, and so on. And then so it's based on this kind of cosmological idea that there are two universes that exist, two parallel universes. You have a universe that is prior to our own world, which is stable, which is always there, which is orderly and in full harmony. And there is our world of change, which, which is plagued by various type of change, calamity, disaster. And then, so how to organize that? So they talk about the first heaven and the anterior or later heaven, right? And those are reflected in the arrangement of the trigram, which are considered as symbol of yin, of the mixity of yin and yang. For instance, all the straight line or yang, all the broken line are yin. So this is extreme yin, this is extreme yang. You can you see my cursor when I move it?
Yes.
Okay, that's good. Okay, Isabel, please let me know when I start to be too long.
No,
How
please
much
go
do
ahead.
I?
It's fascinating.
Sorry?
It's fascinating. Please continue.
Oh, okay. Well, anyway, stop me please because I can go on forever. Okay, so basically we're talking about these patterns, that are the basis of the arrangement of cosmology in a Chinese traditional way. Okay, and this considered, so important that basically at some point in time, when the Chinese thinker tried to organize to a kind of universal understanding of the pattern of the universe, then they use this type of system to it's a kind of taxonomic system, right? So everything is ordered into yin or yang, which one of the five element it belongs to, and then which part of heaven, and then it becomes extremely uh, uh, complex. But it was a kind of a proto-scientific system in some ways, because that's how they approached the understanding of the universe. So astronomy, geography, architecture, battle formation, medicine, categorization of plants, seasons, and so on. Everything was kind of put into this kind of general, overwhelming, overseeing scheme of organization, and that's how basically tradition was vehiculated. So ritual were organized along all these things. So okay, so so how about the Sadak? Where did it come? Where did they come from? Well, we know that the imperial system used a calendar based on the sexagesimal system, right? And we know that there was all the sexagesimal system has to do with the celestial branches and the earthly, no, the earthly branch and the celestial root, and that their combination give rise to yin, yang, the five element, and etc. And you have 60 days, 60 months, well, mostly 60 days and 60-year cycle. Okay. So, I mean, how do you try to get, what does it tell you? Well, we know that there was a movement that actually is the source of the celestial master, the Tianshi Dao, or today we understand them as the Zheng which is there's two main schools in China right now. There's the Chuanzhen and there's the Zheng. So the Zheng is kind of the oldest one. And they tell that their tradition was created by this magical worker by the name of Zhang Daoling, and then who in 142 actually had a revelation by Lao Tzu, the deified Lao Tzu, who came and taught him methods to deal with all the bad things that happen in China. Wars, famine, disaster, etc., the fall of the Han Dynasty. I mean, so it became very important. And these people were ritual specialists. And ritual specialists try to propitiate any types of divinity that they can control or try to coax some favor from. And they follow this kind of universal pattern that I just explained before, right? So the Zhengyi, the Zhang Daoling, or the Tianshi Dao are basically the people that elaborate the first time, this step, maybe not the first time, because we know that the imperial system, who used a sexagesimal calendar, had a roster of spirits that needed to be propitiated by the imperial system in order to make sure that the realm was going to be controlled or going according to the harmonies of the universe and so on. There was even, you know, the Bureau of Rites, you know, that actually maintained this type of roster. And then they linked these two moments in the year. But what the Taoists did is that they basically name spirits and create a very large pantheon of spirits that were pegged to this sexagesimal uh, cycle, and of which they became the ritualists per excellence to propitiate these. Okay, so I will skip a bit because otherwise we will never get out of this. So basically, I started to look at some of the text, you know, that tells you, okay, with this conjunction, or what is the name of the spirits? And it's very interesting to see. So some of the text that I looked at is one of the earliest that belongs to the celestial master tradition. That's the one that you see here, the Nichingwelu, actually tells you about this sexagesimal cycle with the conjunction and the spirits that are attached to it, with the talisman, with their secret name, and how you can invoke their presence and you know, use them during rituals and so on. Another one is the Durenjing, and the Durenjing is very important because it's like the largest scriptures in the Taoist canon, the Daoist, and then it's also the scriptures that is the most, let's say, detail about all the spirits that inhabit the universe, and there's lots of them. And then there was a Durenjing in one version that exists during the Celestial Master, but there was this master by the name of Lin Ningsu that died around 1119, 1120, that became very influential with Song Huizong. And then he actually kind of rewrote and expanded the the Durenjing, the Book of Universal Salvation. Now, why do I talk about it? Because it tells us basically a time work whereby this cult of the Sadak, you know, Chinese version was elaborated. And it gives us also sources whereby we can find some of these spirits and try to enable to see it. So I'm not going to go through this. This is basically detailing the system, the cosmological system that I mentioned, how you classify spirits and all that. It's fairly complicated. So if you pardon me, I don't want to overburden you, so I'll continue. But just to tell you that the cult of these kind of Chinese spirits is still very much active. And there is a temple in the Bayunguan in Beijing and many other places that I've seen, even one in Hong Kong, whereby you can go to a special house, a special temple, where you have the personification in statues of all these various 60 different types of spirits, right? That correspond more or less to the Sadak. Some of them, not all of them, but many of them do correspond to the Sadak spirit, the Tibetan one, right? In the center, you can see Marachi, or actually Beimu, Beidomu, right? The mother of the bear, the dipper, who's in charge of all this, right? And this is an example of all you can see on the tablet, you know, it's the conjunction of all these ones, you know, that these celestial branches and heavenly stalk together. Well, this is more or less like a very simplified Tibetan version of that, whereby you can see this is the A trigram, right? And the name of the transliteration in Tibetan of the name of these Chinese trigrams, like Li, Kun, and so on, right? And then below that, there is the map of the cosmic turtle, which actually is to be found in the Sadak boom, especially when it comes to how do you put forward, you know, how do you elaborate the altar for propitiating the altar, the Sadak. So anyway, so I wanted to talk a bit about, you know, some of the original myth, you know, and then this is an example of the translation of one section, for instance, that I did, where it talks about, you know, the hero of everlastingness. This is the Yongdong version, let's say, of the Bodhisattva, let's say, and how it relates to the myth of Banku, or Panku here, Banku actually, in Chinese, which is the originator of the universe and so on. So it does, you have the myth, a similar version of the myth of Panku, that you find in the Sadak boom. And Panku was, for instance, the template of the later heaven, which gives his body and create all this universe that we are. And as part of the Sadak boom, then it moves to different types of myth, like, for instance, the creation of the universe, our universe, by the trigrams, Old Father Sky Ken and Old Mother Earth Kun. The other one is Ken, but it's Chen. Anyway, they gave life to a son and his sibling, a sister that came into being. The son was the trigram Geng, the mountain, and the sign of the elephant, and the daughter, the trigram Li, fire, and the sign of the horse. Brother and sister sustained each, and they had no equal. The sister pronounced her name as Pon, and said to her brother, "We have no equals, therefore brother and sister will sustain each other." Sustaining meaning that they need to procreate, to have children. So they sustain each other without seeking an equal. In the end, there was no one splendid at the moment, enough apart themselves for serving an excellent progenitor. Okay, so what does it say? It says that basically the origin of our world was made, meaning our people and all the various beings, that were created are the result of a kind of polluting activity they call Nel, right? And then you need purification of that because it's kind of an incestuous relationship, right? And this is why in the Sadak Boom, for instance, they say the reason why one needs to propitiate and have the Sadak is because they are nasty in nature, and they're nasty because of their origin, which was kind of an incestuous relationship and so on. So this is where, in Tibetan, the famous rite of purification of some people, well, let's say what is considered culturally incestuous relationship. So, there's incest, of course. For us, it's a category that is very well defined. But in Tibetan culture, there are also, for instance, categories that would be considered as okay. It's okay. They can marry each other because they are not part of that, what we would categorize as incest or anything like that. But in Tibet, the category is broader. Remember that, the nuclear family is 2 days. In traditional time, it was an extended family, like the. So basically, the Sadak, this is the reason why they need to be appreciated. And what the Sadak booms tell us is this, you have to give them fumigation, so sun, right? Smoke offerings, basically, and symbolic offering. And among these symbolic offerings, you have to give them also red offerings. And red offerings are basically blood offerings. And this is probably the reason why this site was reinvented by Chungutzel in order that it does not need to have these red offerings. But when you look at the original text in the Sadak Boom, you can see that they're all over the place, right? Okay. So this dichotomy between Buddhists and Yungdong versus the other who offer blood sacrifice, it's not only relevant to what happened in Tibet, but it happened also among the Chinese ritualists. Because in China, even all the way to today, there are still ritualists that offer blood offerings to the spirits. But there are the Daoists, like the Jingyi Taoists or the Celestial Master, for instance, and the Chuanzhen, where they go completely against it. And this was one of the main reason or main element of their school or their sect. Starting with the Celestial Master in the 2nd century CE, they distinguished themselves from all the other types of cult by the fact that they didn't use blood offerings and that their pantheon was organized along a celestial bureaucracy type of system. So, okay, so excerpt from the Sadak Boom, for instance, the basic for good fortune, this basic consists in the array of the Sadak, the Lu, the Nien, the planet, and the constellation, right? So basically, there is a method. It talks about the method to propitiate it. It talks about the use of medicinal water to effect purification of obstacle and negativity, right? And then, but when you look at all the prescription in it, it still continue to use traditional Chinese schematic. In the East is the realm of wood element. The basis consists of the Sadak, the Lu, the Nien, the Ja, and the Jukar, the constellation and the stars, the planet. For the South, the realm of fire, the basis consists of the Sadak and so on. And it goes on. So the South is fire, the West is metal, right? The North is water, and the center is the earth. So this is not an Indian cosmological pattern, but it's a Chinese one, right? So the basic cosmogony of the Sadak boom is Chinese traditional cosmogony, right? Yet it follows traditional, Tibetan traditional ritual procedure. Means that it used the Hmong, the ritual proclamation by the officiating priest, the Shenpo they call it, right? Ritual proclamation by the Shenpo. When doing the rites and the prognostication, bring the presence of the gods and demons, the Lanje, with an offering of ritual cake, right, the Torma. They will be overjoyed. The Sadak, the Lu, the Nien, the spirit of the planet and the stars will come. One should also use drum, flat bell, conch together with poetry to call them, as well as mantra, mudra, and dance. The Yidak, the demon, the Shin devil, the Dön sprites, and the spirit enemies will then be disciplined, right? Okay, so I mean, some of the part that probably is lacking time. It's already past an hour of this talk, so is that some other aspect of it. I mean, there's so many to talk about, but there's clearly a lot of local adaptation to Chinese myth and so on. And there's also the rite of propitiation of all these various spirits is not one whereby you just burn incense and offer flowers. On the contrary, there are sections that actually talks about how you have to make like a carpet of flesh, right? And then you spread the flesh, the human, not the human, sorry, the sacrificial parts, of the various animals, to replicate the cosmic turtle, whereby the head of the animal will be, in the same direction that the head of the turtle is. And then, the liver will be probably to the east. And then it goes on with all the various symbolic elements that are ascribed to the various innards, of the sacrificial victim, with the heart being at the top of all that. And it describes how to use actually lustration, pure lustration, and red lustration means that the blood itself also would be used to purify the sacrificial area and so on. So, I mean, so the Sadak is important because you find them all over the place. In Buddhism, they're mostly associated with, the calendar, the astrological calendar, right? They're still linked to the ground, the places, although they're not different than the Yula or the Tudigong or the local lord, right? And then they inhabit all the various parts of the earth and the various planes, the conjunctions of time and so on, right? So we find them all over the place. And then although today, because of possibly the contact of Westerners with, the interest in Tibetan religion is mostly has to do with meditation and self-transformation and so on, we don't seem to be very familiar, to become familiar with this type of discourse and ritual procedure and so on. But actually in the Tibetan world, it is right there. It's very present and so on. And for instance, the cult of the Sadak by the Bumpo is something that is often given to people that go into business. For instance, they have a business, they will ask the Bumpo Lama to come once a year and to do a full ritual of offering to the Sadak, the Lu, the Nien, and the Te. So they will use the Nielam Debji ritual text of Chungo Tsel. Actually, as part of this project, we did have that. The original idea was that I was going to go to Sichuan and be able to film on location the ritual. But, given the pandemic and all these various things, it didn't happen. So instead of going there, I decided to bring two Bumpo Lama actually to Montreal, where in my basement, the university was too problematic to have a Tibetan ritual done there. There was no blood sacrifice. They were Yundrum Bumpo. So, but it was a 3-day affair where we filmed the whole ritual and so on. So hopefully, I hope that in the next few years I'll have, the funds and the possibility of making 2 movies. One would be for people like me, where you have the ritual text and you have the translation, transliteration, and so on. And the other one would be probably a, less than an hour documentary on the world of the Sadak and so on. I think that I should stop here because it's already an hour and 10, and I think that most of you are probably having enough of it. So this is the conclusion is that the worldview of the Sadak Boom is using traditional Chinese metaphysical classification mixed with Tibetan mythical narrative and Tibetan ritual method. And then we can see that the earth element, the local ground, appears the simplest form of conception of the Sadak. However, within the same tradition, oral or scriptural, the other elements of Chinese symbolism are present. The rite used purification with substance and offering, many of the red offering types, right? But still follow the original cardinal and other symbolic arrangement. The many version of similar narrative in the Sadak Boom, as well as the inconsistency among the various chapters, indicate that this work is the result of collage of different elements that might have been strewn from different oral or competing contemporary traditions. And the most important element here for the study of these local cults and ritual collection, such as the Sadak Boom, are the songs and the oral tradition that are not written or that are a variant of what has been written. And this is something that I feel is lacking now. We should go like Tony Hubert did and Kezan Cheshi and records these oral lore that is only learned by heart and not written. And that would be interesting to listen to that, to transcribe them and compare them with all these type of narrative that you found in the Bumji, in the collection of the fourfold collection. I'm pretty sure that we will see a lot of possible, there's a possibility of a lot of correlation there. So that's, I think, my presentation. Thank you. I was going to talk about way more than that, but anyway, I think we should stop it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marc, for your wonderful presentation and very broad and very comprehensive. We can start the round of questions and answers. And if anyone would like to volunteer with the first question, we should. Tony Tidwell would like to start, please.
And thank you, Dr. Desjardins, for a wonderful presentation. I'm not as familiar with the Sadak and the Bumsi and also in the Bun literature, and definitely not the Chinese literature. So this was a very fascinating talk. So I'm more familiar with Tibetan medicine and the Gyusi, and in the Gyusi we really look at Sadak as a type of Dun and as a Jumbo, and that it is body, mind, and behavior. And just curious if you see that in the Chinese literature of a kind of possession or a kind of changing or infecting or transmitting and affecting also through kind of a pathological sort of formation.
Yeah, thank you for your question and your good words. Yes, actually, we see that actually quite early. In some of the archaeological excavation of tombs that date from the 2nd century BCE, for instance, there are already this literature whereby there are spells and so on, that are used in order to heal various types of ailment like toothache and so on. There's this guy at I think he's at the University of Chicago by the name of Donald Harper, who's written a few articles. And so you might want to have a look at it. It's very interesting. And then also the Daoists were specialists in medicine also. one of the first Materia Medica in China was written by a Daoist hierarch by the name of Dao Hongjing. And Dao Hongjing was lived during the Jin dynasty, if I remember well. And then so it's about, I think, 500, I think, are the date, or 5th century or 6th century, something like that. I think it's 6th century. And then so he wrote the first Materia Medica. We have other examples of Taoists like Ge Hong and so on that live in the 3rd century that talks about that. So, I mean, the Taoist lore is full of that. And Chinese medicine, as it even currently is practiced, still use these type of 5 elements, yin and yang, and so on. The Materia Medica of Shennong, for instance, is entirely classified along that. And it's like a thick. I mean, it's so exhaustive and extensive that many of the name of the plants there, even, Chinese scholars have a difficulty in identifying them.
And so the Sadak in that cosmology is also considered a possession type. So I'm thinking like Lu would be a skin disease, a manifestation. We would think of other Din would have different kinds of disease manifestations.
Yes, actually, this I must confess I don't know.
Sure, great.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. No, I don't know, but actually it's a good question. I mean, I should look at it. Thank you very much for raising it. This is a good point.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Anyone else? Ulrike, please.
Thank you, Marc. That's absolutely fascinating. And I have learned a lot today. I had no idea that the Sadak are actually associated with the celestial sphere rather than being down here. For me, they were always in the ground. So thank you for putting that right. I have loads of questions, but maybe I'll just ask about the kind of what do you think about the geographical spread of these ideas? Because I think you located the Sadak Bum mostly in the eastern part of Tibetan areas. Is that right? And if so, how does that relate to all that talk nowadays about Zhangzhung culture, etc.? Whatever we think about that, but I would be curious whether it's possible to locate these ideas geographically and how widespread do you think they might have been?
Thank you, Ulrike. It's very nice to see you. Thank you for coming, by the way. It's nice. Well, that's a very good question. I mean, yes, it seems that in my mind, I see it more probably as an Eastern type of phenomenon, though the text, and the reason why I say that is probably simply because I'm influenced by this idea. I was thinking about where did it come from, right? It came from China, but what's the place it landed in Tibet? And of course, because of the Dunhuang occupation by the Tibetan for a long time. But we cannot say that these actually are used that way because now they're spread out in the periphery all the way to Bhutan, for instance, and there's some indication that even in Nepal, and some other places they might have been used. We know that Ajalo Dodensen, for instance, was from Lojak, for instance, right? And then as for Chungutzel, who knows? So I don't think that we should restrain ourselves to the east. I know that Daniel Berunsky is, for the Nien, he's very convinced that the Nien cult seems to be associated with a clan which is called the Dong clan, right? And they moved all over the place. And then so as they moved, they brought with them their kind of cult of the Nien and so on. And eventually it was absorbed, into the Yongdrung burn and made kind of more universal by that. So the Sadak, I really don't know, I must confess, but I think that actually there's quite a possibility that it was more linked to the Tibetan government, during the Imperial period, because of their relationship that they had with the town court. And then there are some, in some historical document, I can't remember the name, but there are just mentioned, very terse mention that says that actually they were the Tibetan that were sent to China to learn the art of writing a calendar and studying that. And then so, at the same time, it's a connection. And the cult of Tai Sui, is definitely one that was very big and started to be much more official during the Tang Dynasty. So I cannot really tell you anything really intelligent about that, except the fact that I don't know. I mean, I suspect that it's from the central government because it's linked to calendrical activities, right?
Hmm.
And then we know that the Tibetan government, for instance, elaborate writing and so on for the purpose of administration. And calendar was always extremely important because calendar is when you have meetings with all these people, these government officials, and then where you coordinate the yearly activities of the government. So calendar was very central in China.
Mm, mm. Yeah, of course, and I mean also the Tibetan historical sources always tell us that both geomancy and astrology were imported from China, etc., etc. Yeah.
Yes, yes. So, but I mean, it's just evidence, we have to really dig deep into so many sources and so on that are becoming more and more available.
Mm,
But the Bimpu source are, at least these that, like the Sadak Boom, are very useful, I think, because it really portrays us a version of Burn that many suspected, but that the Yungdrung Burn, contemporary Burn, wants to deny or brush over or try to ignore as much as possible.
fascinating.
Interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the questions and to Marc for his answers. Is there anyone else? Isabel.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. It was really, really fascinating. And thank you for also giving us a lecture about Chinese cosmogony and Daoist cosmogony, because, you can tailor your research to different audiences. And here we're Tibetologists, so we need to be prepped on these things that are so common for sinologists, for example. Um, I have a kind of joke question for you first, and then a more real question. The joke question is, after sponsoring this Sabdak ritual, did you notice any benefit, be they material benefits, spiritual benefits, that have fallen onto either you or Montreal as a community or else? That this is a joke. You're not obliged to answer that. And then, so my real question actually stems from total ignorance. So, is there a description of how these non-Tibetan cosmogony ritual practices were integrated within the Tibetan tradition and so preserved in a way in the Bön? Because they are supposed to be local gods. So it's not only a calendrical intersection in time, there is also a geographic dimension to it. And then the whole thing is personified as a god or a deity that needs to be propitiated. So in order to do that, they had to localize those deities, I imagine. Is there any element at all in the extant literature that would allow for a cultural history to be written? How was this done? Like I see two processes, uh, either piling up, you get a tradition where you propitiate the gods from this tradition, that tradition, and you just pile them up. You don't order them. But some of them do the same sort of ritual things. So would there be like a conflict between propitiating Nyen for this occasion, then Sabdak for that occasion, and then say, we have to choose which is the most efficient one, or rewrite the whole pantheon so that it makes a super integrated system. So according to your research, is there any way that we can write how this integration was made and the choices that were made? Or did the ritualists just pile up any kind of rituals that they could without making them hierarchical or blending them? If my question is clear enough.
It's a very complex question because it depends where you look and then what you want to focus on. And then, as you know, the Burn tradition is manifold, like the Buddhist tradition. It's very complex. It's huge. It's a bit like Taoism also, which is enormous, so there are various methods, I think. First of all, the Fourfold Collection texts, are useful because we see that they are, basically just collected thing all put together. And then because we see the same myth retold in a different way, and so on. And then this is something that is common among ritualists. We see that instead of choosing one narrative, they will just recite all of them, even if it's about the same myth that, change the story and so on, they do that. So there is this element of keeping the tradition without necessarily editing it. But there is another way also. Well, Chungutzel, for instance, with his Nilam Debji, for instance, ritual, what he did was he organized it into a coherent, the cult of the Sadak, the Lu, and so on. So this is a historical moment in the 12th century or beginning of the 13th century. That's when it was done, right? So, okay. So this is for the Sadak, the Lu, and these type of beings. But there are other cycles. Like, for instance, I remember giving a talk on Geku. Geku is very important, is associated with the former Zhangzhong and so on, And then when you look, you start to look at actually the ritual texts and the various deities, you can see that they really come from different places. They're not the same. They're not. So it's the Geku cycle is a kind of synthesis of various different local divinities that are territorial, that are brought together into a kind of a mandala, right? So you have that in Buddhists too, like the cult of Chakrasamvara, for instance, with the 24 places and so on. Well, the Bumpo have their own 24 places too, and they're all part of the Maju mandala. So when you study, for instance, the Maju system, then you will have the 24 territorial place that makes Tibet whole, the kingdom of Maju in some ways. But you have like over 360 spirits, that are grafted onto this scheme arranged by the elements and the corner of the world and this and that. So what can we make of it? I mean, I think that we can write to a certain extent, or we can try, to write a cultural history. But I mean, the amount of work that is needed is staggering because of the text that needs to be read. And then the little detail that we have about the history of Tibet, from during the Imperial period, even that is very sketchy. So I mean, it's a very ambitious project, and I can see that it could be done, but you would really need a lot of specialists that would specialize, on people would go into ritual texts and the commentarial literature and so on, and dig out the material. So you can imagine the amount of work that needs to be done. So I think that we need to do another Sadak ritual in order to help it.
Thank
That
you.
is a very innovative solution to this.
Then we'll be able to write the real benefits of the Sadak.
Raised by
But
Isabel.
remember, they're troublemaker too.
Thank you so much. Is there anyone else who would like to ask a question? Otherwise, I wanted to ask something, but it's not because I'm coming from a very different area of studies. I'm very, very ignorant, more ignorant than anyone here. So my question was, how popular is Bong among Chinese practitioners now, comparing to other Buddhist schools practitioners?
Right. I mean, Bumpo, although they were once a majority, however you want to define them, because what we call Yundrung Bön nowadays might not have been, what people imagine as the original religion of Tibet that was universally practiced the same way all over Tibet. Most likely not. Was probably lots of local specific cult attributed to certain clans and so on. So, but with the rise of Buddhism, and especially with Buddhism hierarchy taking the reign of, the temporal administration of Tibet, then the Bumpo, have been, let's say, on a declining status for a long period of time. But there are still parts in Tibet, whereby the majority is Bumpo, like Songpan, for instance, one of them. Then you will find them in, in Amdo also, there are sections where the entire prefectures are Bumpo. And then, and there's some other place like Nakchu also and so on, where the Bumpo are very present and so on. But this is not the majority of the population. But I would say that probably at least a quarter of the population. And then even then, you know, you can see that there's cross-fertilization too. I mean, like for instance, there is a Lama that is very famous in the US, for instance, who is a Kaji Lama, but his mother was a Bumpo, for instance, you know. So, you know, so we have a tendency in the West to think that, you know, if you're a Bumpo, you cannot be Buddhist, you know. If you're Catholic, you cannot be Orthodox, or you cannot be Muslim, or you cannot be Jewish, or whatever. You know, we have this kind of sectarian type of thinking. But actually, the fieldwork doesn't necessarily bear that, or at least it didn't bear it in the 90s and in the 2000 and so on. And then because I've seen Tibetan women that were Pandan, so they were Buddhist and studying with Bonpo Master. As for the Chinese aspect of it, I mean, many of the monasteries that have been rebuilt after 1985 actually were rebuilt with a lot of Chinese money. And then by the time, when the time of, you know, very wealthy Chinese business people, you know, were having parties in Beijing or in Shanghai, you know, it was customary to have, you know, a Tibetan Lama that was present there. And then so in some ways, you know, there was a connection between the development of religious institution, the rebuilding of religious institution in Tibet, or in the Tibetan area in Sichuan, in Qinghai, in Gansu, with the Chinese elite, let's say. This has not continued as much as it did in the 90s and in the year 2000 and 2010 because of the new policies that were introduced by the Chinese government, especially after 2008, where they tried to curtail more and bring up, you know, more the you know, current political aspect of China that they want to develop there. But definitely, the Chinese have been extremely instrumental in the rebuilding of Tibetan monasteries, retreat center, and so on. Very important, and they still are. They still are major sponsors of at least in Sichuan, definitely.
Thank you. But actually, my focus was more on, like, if we are talking about Han population, because you hear a lot that Tibetan Buddhism is popular among the Chinese population in China, and but usually we are thinking about Buddhism, and I'm thinking about Gelug or other schools. And do you think, would you say that Bong is also popular among
Very,
the Chinese
very,
practitioners?
very popular because many Bonpo Lama present themselves as Bon Buddhists, let's say, or, you know, they present Bon as a form of Buddhism, but that is prior to the Buddha. I mean, they go so far as saying that Tonpa Shenra, for instance, lived, like one Lama said, you know, 3,500 years ago. And then in some book, people say, well, he lived 18,000 years ago and so on, you know. So, you know, there's always, like Hank Bledsoe say, you know, the burn that is forever old or something like that. But but yes, so when it comes to us, you know, Chinese in general are like us, the same way. They don't necessarily make a distinction between sect and schools until they get really committed to one, and then they make a difference, for instance, right? So at some point in time, the Chinese government opened in the 90s, they support the study of Burn because the idea was to try to undermine the role of Buddhism in politics in Tibet and go back to the root of the Tibetan people, like, you know, the original religion of the Tibetan, which was not Buddhism and so on. And it most likely had possibly to do with some political reasons and so on, but it didn't last very long. But I remember in the 90s when I lived in Sichuan at Sichuan University, there was this Lama by the name of Yunrun Nepejens, Ayung Lama, he was known, very famous Lama. He would come to Sichuan University, I would make come and so on. But we met actually in a research institute that was devoted to the study of the Burn Tibetan canon or the Tibetan canon. But actually, it was a Bonpo center, and so they were researching the Bonpo canon.
Mhm.
but it was supported by the Chinese government. And there is a publication of that in Chinese mostly, that is, describing the catalog of the burn canon and so on. But nowadays, what they do is that the trend is more like to study the ancient kingdom of Jiangsu, which is now most people seem to claim that it's existed in Western Tibet mostly. But, the Bimpo books are so unclear also as to its exact location and so on. But the consensus is to be Western Tibet, the Kailash area and so on. And then so the Chinese government has been supporting some international conference. I went to one of them in Lhasa, actually. That was 2018, I think. And after that, no, there was two of them. Yeah, there was a third one that was supposed to happen, but because of not only political, but mostly disaster that happened in China. There was flooding and so on in Sichuan and so on. So it was all canceled. It was a year where there was lots of natural disaster in China. So right now I cannot tell what's going to happen, but I hope there's going to be some more. But yes, the presence of a Chinese patron and supporter is very, very much there. And then I cannot judge for how we can compare it to the Burn versus the Buddhist. I am not able to do that. As far as I know, there is no data on that.
No, but you answered my question. Thank you so much.
Okay.
In a very, again, comprehensive way. So thank you a lot for sharing.
Pleasure.
Is there anyone else who would like to ask something? Isabel?
If Marc still has a lot of energy, because it's been going for quite a while now. But I'm really curious. So you've been talking a lot about history, the text, and so on. But another part of your methodology is field work, right? Anthropology, observation. And as I understand, you're just starting that through the Sadak ritual in Montreal that you have videoed and all that. Then you had a project in Nepal. I don't know if it's still going to happen, that project in Nepal. So could you tell us, how do you approach methodologically? What do you aim to do with, studying contemporary Bonpo ritualists doing these rituals? How are you going to do that?
Okay. I mean, I started to do that in the 1990s, early 1990s, because I spent a lot of time in Bonpo monasteries, retreat center, and so on. So the ritual has always been my approach. I have hours of recorded ritual on old cassette tape and so on. And then, so it's been, a long interest of mine, especially ritual performance. That's what interests me the most. And then out of that, of course, you need to know, how it works, what's the relationship between the various parties, not only the performer, but those that are sponsoring them and so on. So this, I've done it quite a long time. Well, at some point in time, after 2008, it was impossible to do that or very difficult. And because of the various policies that changed, and then also research funding was, I mean, non-existent in Canada. I mean, for me, I remember applying for 19 different research grants, it's how much work it is, each of them, none of them leading anywhere. So, I mean, the funding was a big problem for me anyway. Some other people have been more lucky, like Valentina Punzi, for instance, who did some study on the Baima, was able to photograph a lot of manuscripts and also record some ritual, and Danielle here and there. And so now I'd like to continue that, preferably within the Chinese border, because that's the community I'm most familiar with. And then I can work my way better there. My Tibetan sucks, and then so I can use half Tibetan, half Sichuanese or Chinese, and then it works. And then reading the book, that's okay now. So, and then a lot of the largest institution of Burn now, they are not in central Tibet. They are in Western China. Well, Central Tibet is Western. Anyway, they're in Sichuan or in Qinghai. That's where they are. Nangji Monastery, right? Aba, Ngawa. And then you have Yishe Gön in Yadong or Xinlongshan, and then some others. So this is for me the best place. Ideally, I like to do that. In Nepal, there is a project going on, mostly under the leadership of Charles and so on. And then I discuss at some point in time with, doing this study with some Bumpo communities, in Nepal. But the dynamics is very different. And also the worldview is completely different. I mean, now and then also to be able to travel in the little places where you have these ritualists that are not necessarily belonging to Yundum school, just to get a permission to get there. Then they speak in vernacular. I mean, Tony Hubert was really good, it took years for him to be able to do this type of field work and so on, and do the recording and so on. So, I mean, he's a champion, but he had the fundings to be able to support him to do all these things. And then Kezan Chashi did it for his PhD, but now he's veered on to some other thing, which is very unfortunate.
Yeah, you mentioned Kesan Tashi a few times. I don't know him. Where did he do his PhD?
I think in Australia. And then you can see his book has been published by Oxford University Press. It's called World of Worldly Gods. I should write a review, actually. It's a good book. It's very good. But for people like me, it leaves me very thirsty. Because you can see that and I did talk to him at some point in time, but he told me that he changed his topic now. He's not doing that anymore. But I mean, there's so much promises, and the problem is that these people that do these type of ritual, they are disappearing. Many times the tradition is either not transmitted, or you have a Yungdrung Bumpo that comes and say, no, we don't do this anymore. We do it that way. And then they supply a tradition that is completely reformulated, and then that contains all the elements that will more or less satisfy the local people. So you have these things that are just disappearing. So that's why it's good to go to China, because you go to a place like Teo and even in Songpan, despite the fact that Yundum Burn is present all over the place, ritualists, like among the Baima and some others, are still there. Right. But again, funding is the main problem.
Yeah, funding, permits.
Yeah. Isabel, do you want to ask anything else?
Well, yeah, but we could do that over nice dinner or beer or whatever. But yeah, it's endless.
I vote for that. I
Yeah.
vote for that.
Your topic is so rich, so amazing. All your knowledge also.
There's lots of things to study, I'm just one person, but there's so much to do. So we need lots of more people, And then so Tibetan studies should really be developed, and not necessarily monopolized by, certain field or tendencies. It should be much more comprehensive, I would say. There's lots of good people now that have all the expertise to do that, In China now, I can think of at least 2, 3 people, if not more. I mean, not only Tsering Ta and Nonju Dajjal, who are retired now, but young students that just finished their PhD, like Peldun, for instance, is one of them. And, there's many others. And then also in France, there's Ninja Tsering, for instance, who's absolutely doing. This guy is like a promise for the field, and there's so many other people. So yeah, we need more researchers.
Fantastic. May we be heard.
Maybe we should appreciate the Sadak one more time.